All right, everybody, let's take a dive right into camera mode. So you've probably been out shooting with your camera and you've got this knob on top that kind of shows a bunch of different things. So let's dive into what each of these things means. So we've got our custom modes, our bulb mode, our manual mode, our aperture value mode, our time value mode, our program mode, and automatic. Let's start with the most basic, with automatic. So when you have the automatic mode on your camera on, this is what happens. So your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO, and your white balance are all entirely controlled by the camera. And this is nice and simple if you're just new to shooting and want to go out and just capture an image without having to worry too much about all these settings. But as we kind of peel back layers in this class, we'll find that we want to have a little bit more manual control. So we'll kind of progress naturally through this, and looking at the program mode is a good next step for taking your photographs. So what is it that the program mode does? So the idea with program mode is that you now have the ability to kind of take over these controls. So whereas before in automatic mode, the camera was making all the decisions for you, now you can kind of pick and choose, hey, I want to override the sensitivity of my camera with the ISO, or I want to adjust the white balance, right? In automatic mode, if you were trying to make something either warm or neutral or cool, the camera was going to just arbitrarily say, I think this is neutral, here's what you get. But now you can override it and say, hey, I want to actually change my value.
And I think you might do this in a time where you're sort of happy shooting mostly auto, but there may be one or two sort of instances where you're like, no, actually, I want something different to happen, and you're going to sort of override the auto mode. So it's sort of auto mode light, really, in some ways, right?
Yeah, but it's like a good next step from just being in auto mode, because you have the option to make these changes. All right, up next we have time value mode, and this is where we control how long your image is exposed for, and the side effect of that is how much motion blur you see in your image. So is your subject completely frozen? Is your subject blurry? In this mode, your camera is still going to choose the aperture for you and the ISO, although you can override the ISO. And you can also choose to have the white balance be an automatic, or you can override it manually. But the idea with this one is the main thing that you're focusing on is how much blur you have, and you're not worrying about how to expose the rest of the image. So you can just say, hey, I want to have a little bit of motion blur, I want to freeze my subject, or I want to have a lot of motion blur, depending on what it is you're shooting. And so let's look at a couple of examples of this. So here we have this water where we can kind of see every single droplet of water has been frozen, and we're really freezing just a moment in time. And it feels very different from an image like this, where the water, we're seeing a half a second of time where water is actually flowing. Right on the first image, this is 1/4000th of a second, which is the upper bound of the camera. Yeah, so I mean just a really minuscule portion of time versus the half a second. And there's a whole range in between as well. My camera shoots from 1/4000th of a second to half a second, and you can even
to longer, probably.
Yeah,
right?
to even longer.
Yeah.
But the range that I shot for this image were all these steps in between, and this is what you're choosing when you're using the time value mode. You're saying, camera, you choose how to expose the image for me, but what I care about is the time value or the shutter speed. So this is how long the image is being exposed.
So you can think about it as you're choosing an artifact of the exposure controls, in this case motion blur, to focus on and decide very particularly how much motion blur you want in this image, and then sort of wave your hands at the rest of the exposure controls. Let the camera sort of decide that for you.
Exactly. So a couple other examples of why you might want to use this if you want to kind of blur everything in your frame and really add this feeling of craziness to a night scene. Or if you actually want to just like highlight your, freeze your subject, right? You can pan, in this image, I'm panning the camera with the boy swinging so that he appears sharp, but everything else feels blurry. All right, so up next after time value, we have the aperture value mode, and this controls how big the opening in the lens is that lets light through. So if you recall that the side effect of the aperture is how deep your depth of field is, right? The visual artifact is like how much is in focus in your shot. Is it a very shallow depth of field? Is it a very deep depth of field? This is what you're controlling when you're in aperture value mode, right? So the camera is going to decide the rest of the exposure settings for you, which is the shutter speed, the ISO, and the white balance is also something you can set. You can also override these settings as indicated by this chart. So Ian, when might you want to do this? When would you want to control aperture mode?
Well, I think in certain situations you want to sort of maybe declutter the background and focus a little bit more on, say, a specific subject. So you might want a shallow depth of field where only your subject is in focus and the rest of your background sort of softens and blurs, and it really sort of draws the viewer's eye into your subject. Conversely, if you want, maybe you want a deep depth of field to sort of illustrate a large environment or to have a foreground object relate to a far background object, then maybe you want a deep depth of field.
Or even simply if you're taking an image of a group of people, right?
Sure,
You've got people
right.
at different depths.
Yep,
so.
absolutely. So there's plenty of reasons to increase your depth of field to make sure that you have more things in focus in your image, but there's also some sort of aesthetic reasons to actually shrink it down.
Yeah, and it's funny, like the iPhone has portrait mode, which fakes this effect,
Yes,
right? It
yeah.
literally like
Adds a
traces
blur.
you and adds a blur to the background, but this is if you want to do it for real optically in the camera, this is the one of the modes you can use to achieve that. So here's an image with a shallow depth of field, right? Our subject is isolated from the background. This is not a particularly pretty background, so maybe a good choice here aesthetically. So this is an opening of 1.4. And if we look at a deep depth of field in the same thing, so we're looking at f11 at this point, we have a much deeper depth of field. We can see all the junk in the background, not a particularly pleasing image. So maybe an aesthetic choice here would be to go with the blurred background. Manual mode. So,
Bum, bum, bum.
Ian, what mode do you shoot in when you take a camera out typically?
I shoot pretty much solely in manual mode. I think that there are occasional situations where I'll choose a priority mode. Usually if things are happening very fast around me and I don't, maybe I'm shooting a sports game or something like that. But for the most part, it's manual mode so that I can sort of really think about the images that I'm making and choose each sort of setting in a very proactive way.
Yeah, and the trade-offs are time, right? Like
Right.
you need to sit there and actually adjust the camera for
Yeah.
each of the settings and think about what the implications are.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something you want to play around with as you get more experienced, but I think once the training wheels are off, this is a great mode to go to really reinforce what you've learned and to take a deep dive into your camera and exposure settings.
Yeah, and practice makes perfect too. The sort of muscle memory of doing this, and there's a little bit of intuition that builds, and you do get faster. And so if you're sort of shooting in manual mode to start with, and it's a bit of a struggle, and you miss the image that you're trying to take because you're too busy fiddling with camera functions, like understand that you will get better and you will get faster, and that sort of you'll be able to sort of snap off a picture sort of very rapidly afterwards. So don't get discouraged, I would say.
All right, so in manual mode, this is where you choose everything for your camera. You choose the aperture setting, which affects the depth of field. You choose your shutter speed, which affects your motion blur. So you can let the camera entirely decide your ISO, or you can tell it a range to stay within, because as you get really high in the ISO, you get a lot of noise, and maybe that's not desirable. And then you can also choose to set your white balance manually, or you can set it to auto mode as well.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so up last here is bulb mode. So bulb mode is like shooting in manual mode, except it's typically for having a longer exposure than 30 seconds, right? You can easily dial your camera's shutter speed down to a 30-second exposure, but most cameras, to go over that, you need to actually use the bulb mode. So usually this is done, back in the old days, you actually had a physical air bulb that attached to your camera that you would squeeze and hold and let the exposure happen. Now you can hold in the shutter button on the camera, like push your shutter release and hold it, but the problem with that is your camera's going to shake if you're sitting there with your finger on it. So in modern digital cameras, it might handle it differently, but there's a setting in the 5D Mark IV, which we have in front of us, which you can set the interval for, and so anything from, 30 seconds to probably some number of hours for exposure. So that you can push the shutter button and let it sit and just expose the whole time.
And you'll often use this in conjunction with like the external device that is on the slide is actually just a shutter release, right? So you'll have a small button that you can depress, and it's connected via a cable to the camera, so you're not actually touching the camera, so it can remain very still. And when you release it, it clicks the shutter open, and then it will, when you let go, it'll either close the shutter, or if it's on the timer mode, like when the timer runs out, it'll close the shutter automatically for you.
Exactly, and so this is for typically longer time lapses. Like this was a 20-minute shot. I've done shots for hours at a time before. It kind of depends on your use case, but bulb mode is typically just for very long exposures. All right, so Ian, choosing your mode kind of comes down to what it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
As with most things in photography. If things are happening quickly and you don't have full control over a situation, maybe you don't want to shoot in full manual mode, maybe choosing aperture priority if you know that you want to be able to adjust your depth of field quickly, or if you're shooting a sports game or you're shooting something where you know that you want to have motion blur, it'd be important to choose time value mode so that you don't worry about the overall exposure of your image.
Yeah, or not motion blur, right? If you're shooting a sports game and you want to sort of freeze people who are moving pretty fast on a field far away, then you might increase your shutter speed. So there's a lot of different opportunities to leverage these to help making certain shooting situations easier, but at the end of the day, you're just sort of letting the camera make choices for you. And so we're obviously going to encourage you to make as many choices as you can because that's how you sort of refine your aesthetics. So
Yeah.
we're going to push you towards manual mode, right? But understanding that there are situations where these different shooting modes are valuable.
Exactly. And so there'll be more resources on general exposure and metering and all that kind of thing. But that was camera modes.